Okay. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone wherever you are around the world. This is Achiever Zone Season 2, Episode 3, with my good friend. I call him Dr. Shmoo. We're going to be talking about understanding mental health. Today is the 23rd of March, Saturday, 23rd of March, 2024. And I have with me my very good friend and brother, Dr. Sosunmolu Shoyinka. I call him Dr. Shmoo. Dr. Shmoo, you're welcome. How are you?
Thank you so much, Shi. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. We go back a long way, and I'm
I
so glad.
know.
I'm so honored to have the opportunity to be on this fantastic program that you've put together.
Thank you so much for coming on board. I know everything was just arranged by God because we've not seen for so long. And then you came around sometime last year in December, and I
Yeah.
happened to have some free time, and we were able to work something out to meet.
Yes.
And we just clicked and kind of reminiscent on things that we've done before, and this topic just came up,
Yeah.
and you were you know willing and favorable to us, and you said yes to it, and today here we are. So thank you so much for doing that, and thanks for coming on board. I'll go through a quick introduction of yourself, but again, it'd be good for you to say from your perspectives. I will introduce you as my brother. We've known each other since our teenage years, if I remember correctly, donkey years ago.
Yep.
And even though you're in the States and I'm in Nigeria, we've tried to touch base, like
Yeah.
once in a while. But again, you physically came in last year, and that's where we met, and we caught up quickly, and you agreed to come on board. So again, I know you as a multi-award-winning psychiatrist, author, and speaker, and you currently serve as the clinical associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania, where you teach policy and leadership. Um, your recent job was serving as the Chief Medical Officer for Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability Services. I would like you to just take it on from here and just talk about what you did there and the things that you want my audience and the rest of the community to know about you.
Well, again, thank you so much, Shay, for being here. I've been watching the episodes and listen. It's really impressive. I listened to the last episode on marriage and I was taking notes the
Right.
entire time.
Wow.
So I really appreciate your leadership and vision in putting this together. I also listen to your snippets and
Yes.
and
Yeah.
I've read your blog and I think it's fantastic material. So thank you for
Thank
what
you.
you're doing. This is so needed. And I also want to really publicly thank you for making the time to visit when I was in Abuja last year.
Right.
It was one of the highlights of my trip.
Thank you.
So, yeah. My background, I'm a psychiatrist. I actually started my training in Nigeria right after I finished medical school in Ibadan, which
Right.
is where we met. And I trained in a little bit in Lagos at Yaba, and then I went to England where I continued my training for a year and a half, and then I moved to the States. Currently, I'm board certified in three specialties and qualified in a fourth one, which I did not do the certification in officially.
Right.
I recently served as the chief medical officer for Philadelphia, which essentially was being the chief psychiatrist for the city. And
Right.
because of Philadelphia's role in the, or positioning, I should say, in the state, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the US generally, that role put me in touch with, I was involved in a lot of state affairs and um, also some federal work.
Hmm.
And I've taught my entire career. Right now, I'm a clinical associate professor at Penn, and I teach a class in policy and leadership. I also serve on
Right.
several um, think tanks and committees and so on at the federal level. I would say I worked at Philadelphia as the chief psychiatrist for just a bit less than 5 years. And in
Wow.
that
Okay.
role, I was mostly, yeah, and in that role, I was mostly responsible for policy and I'll talk about policy a little bit and systems operations. So when it came to how the system operated, we had a network of over 200. individual providers, some of which are big hospital systems like University of
mm,
Pennsylvania, Thomas Jefferson, Einstein, and so on. And all of those and many other mid-sized and smaller agencies really were in a network, and I was responsible for a lot of the programming and so on. So um,
mm.
that's what I've done. Before that, I worked in for-profit managed care, and I
Right.
was responsible for as a medical director for two states, Missouri and Kansas. And at some point, I
Mm.
was involved in overseeing at least the medical stuff for four states. So
Right.
I've been very blessed, been very fortunate. My most important job, however, is being a father and a husband.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes.
I know that because I mean, like I said, we grew up together, so we kind of came up from the same background, and some of the
Yeah.
things that we were taught, I can see them, in the way you handle stuff, your family, and everything. So, I'm blessed to have you on board on this episode, and I'd like you to also talk about your book, because again, the topic we're discussing centers around that as well.
Absolutely. And I can say exactly the same. I can see those early seeds have blossomed in your life. And I can tell, just the way you talk. And I know, I looked at your daily regimen and I thought, okay, if I can say this in Yoruba, Omo Pastor Lubi Lili.
Yeah,
I could
yeah,
tell. I can definitely see all of that. So yes, thank you for the opportunity to talk about the book. And I'll say a little bit about the book and a little bit about where it came from, the idea for the
right,
book. So this was not something I just kind of decided to do. It was really an assignment. I felt um, led to do it. Let's just put it that way. Um,
right,
One of the things that I've learned, again, I've practiced psychiatry on three continents now, and in the
right,
states, I've practiced psychiatry in 4 or 5 states. So you get to see some common themes come up over time, and I've done this for 20 plus years. So you get to see some
right,
common themes over time. Historically, psychiatry or I would say the field of mental health and has been broadly misunderstood. This is in all of society, right? Many, many
right,
myths, many misunderstandings. But you see that even more so in faith circles. And obviously, I'm a Christian, so I'm much more familiar with the Christian faith and that arena. But I've seen this
right,
also in the Muslim community. I've seen this also in other faith communities. So this is
right,
common. The faith community. So because mental health conditions are so common, we'll get into
mm,
this in the material. It's like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 here in the
right.
U.S. In other parts
Okay.
of the world, according to the World Health Organization, is 1 in 8. In Nigeria, it is 40%. By some
Wow.
studies, 40% of individuals struggle with some sort of mental health condition. That's not far-fetched when you look at the environment, right? It's exceptionally
Exactly.
stressful, especially here
Right.
recently. So very common, but and so impact people of in the faith community as well. But what happens is because of stigma, because there's a misunderstanding that breeds fear and
Mm,
misinformation, we tend to either dismiss it, that's keep it out of our consciousness, we don't talk about it. When we do see it manifest, we run away from it or we ostracize the
right.
people that suffer from these conditions.
Yeah.
Or we punish them, we abuse them,
True.
right? Or
Right.
we assign a very simple cause to it. We only think about it from spiritual as a spiritual issue, from the spiritual
Right.
perspective. The
Right.
benefit
Right.
of, and I've been very fortunate, like I've said, I've had training at some exceptional institutions. And what
Mm,
that does, and I'm certified in several specialties, what that does, and I've seen um, mental health in many different arenas, right, from many
mm,
perspectives because of my career experience.
right.
What you learn is that there's a multitude of factors that lead to a person having mental health concerns,
Mm.
right? So the idea behind the book was to demystify mental health for faith
That's the
community.
word, actually. Yes.
Demystify, give people very clear understanding, and do so in very simple language. Like eliminate
Yeah.
all the confusion, make it clear.
Right.
That's the
Right.
first reason. The other reason is that, especially in our environment, faith leaders, people gather into faith communities, right? So faith
Mm-hmm.
leaders are very influential.
Yeah.
So if you have people come, and most people go seek help from their faith community first. So if you think about
Mm.
us, how we grew up, you had something
Yeah.
going on in your life, you probably went to the pastor first, or at some
Correct.
point, one of the first people that you notified was your pastor or your small group leader or your small group. That's kind of where
Yeah.
you got your assistance from. So if there's an understanding of where these conditions come from, how they manifest, what they look like in real time,
Mm.
and how they
Mm.
can be addressed, in addition to our usual faith practices that we do, prayer, seeking
Mm.
health counsel, using, confessions and things like that. In addition to that,
Yeah.
we can actually do the corresponding action of guiding people to, well, these are some things you can do. You can see a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Medication makes a world of
Mm.
difference. Counseling can
Mm.
really, really be effective, especially the evidence-based counseling. So the idea behind writing the book, to summarize it, is to demystify mental health, to reduce
Yeah.
stigma, and to give people tools that they can
Right.
use either to help other people when they're in crisis, or to for themselves to work on their own mental health and wellness.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that. I mean, it's safe to summarize that you are the expert here and you will demystify this for us. You and I were talking earlier that back in the day when we were growing up, mental health, was not too common. Now is a fashionable thing. I think in the last 3 5 years now, people are talking about it. Even in your organization where you work, they mention that now, but back in the day, there was nothing like that. And just like you rightly said, some people were abused because of that, because they didn't really understand it. And I've noticed generally in human behavior, anything we don't understand, we try and either attack or possibly ostracize, and we don't talk about it. And these are common things that, you could, with the right kind of procedure and process, you could get out of it and get to a place where things work for you mentally. And like I was telling you earlier, from a productivity point of view, it's also part of your pyramid for productivity, because if you're not okay with your mental health, it ultimately affects your physical body. And if you're sick and you're not doing well, you can't even perform at your job, so it's all tied together. So thank you for that. You are the right expert to talk to. Like you mentioned, you've practiced this across 3 continents. So we've come to the right table. We're sitting down, we're going to take notes, and let's just run through these objectives as we go through, the session.
Absolutely. And to your point, I'll talk about the objectives in just one quick moment, but let me just
Right.
riff off of what you said very quickly. Freud, who is the one of the leading figures in modern psychiatry,
Yeah.
defined mental health very succinctly. He said it's the ability to love, that is, have
Mm.
relationships, quality,
Right.
productive relationships, and to work, that is, to be a productive person, contributing to your society in a productive way that's germane to you as an individual. So what
Right.
would like I think from an objective standpoint, what I'd like people to leave this discussion with is, number one is, as you rightly said, understand the role of mental health in overall health. And there's a
Correct.
saying that we'll talk about maybe over and over again: with there's no health without mental health. And I promise you, whether you're looking at it from a societal level, you're looking at it from a financial level, which I've had to do at various points in my career, you're looking at it from
Right.
an individual level, you're looking at it from a family level, or even a larger community perspective, there
Mm.
is no health without mental health. So that's the first thing.
Cor-
You can't even
Right.
really practice as a person of faith without being mentally well.
Absolutely.
Without mental health, everything else comes out sort of distorted, because your
Mm.
best intentions flow out through your will and your mind and your emotions. So we learned
Right.
that as young men, you and I.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Then understand the role of faith, which can oftentimes be an enhancer to mental health.
Mm.
And there's
Right.
actual science for this. There's data, there's research evidence for this. Or
Yeah.
in some cases, unfortunately, when faith practices are distorted, it can
Mm.
actually harm people's mental health. So, and I think we need to talk about both those things.
Both
And
sides.
then,
Right.
yes, we have to talk about both sides. We have to be honest and, and deal with the negatives as well as the positives. And then I'd
Right.
love for people to leave this discussion with three strategies to promote their wellness and resilience. And I will say that in your regimen, you have a lot of them. And I was delighted to see that. All right. So
Right.
what is
That's good.
health? Yeah. So you're doing all the right stuff. Shay. You're a good role model for the rest of us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. All right. So this is the definition of health according to the World Health Organization. It's not just absence of disease. It's really functioning at your best. It's having all
Right.
the parts of you, um, physically, emotionally, socially, in a good place, humming along well, whole, so that you can work at your best. And if people look at their own lives, the time when we're the
Mm.
most productive is when we have rich relationships, we're in balance in our relational lives, we're physically healthy, and we are mentally healthy, and obviously spiritually healthy as well. And those
Absolutely.
things have, it's work to keep those things in balance. Now for mental health, I already talked about this. Let's just summarize it. It's the ability to love and to work. It's being in a good place emotionally. And I think we talked about, I think it's important to, when we talk about health and wellness, um, and I think it's important to keep in mind that people often default to healthcare, that is, going to see a doctor, going to see some sort of
Doctor.
clinician or
Right.
practitioner. That's
Mm.
important, but that is really the very tip top of that pyramid, right?
Mm.
The most important thing, and this is again more and more nowadays, we're hearing about social determinants as being key to overall health. It turns
Right.
out that the things that really determine your overall health the environment where you grew up, your education, your job status, who you're
Mm.
in relation connection with, your income,
Mm.
safety in our communities, and we
Mm.
can talk about that both here in the U.S., where there's high levels of community violence and gun
Right.
violence, or in Nigeria, where there's the constant threat of um,
Kidnapping and all.
kidnapping and so on.
Mm. Oh,
Just
okay.
a moment.
All right. All right. So I'll just hold on.
Economic factors, feeling safe
Right.
in being safe and feeling safe in your community, your ability to support your family financially,
Mm.
poverty, and so on. These are things that have a pernicious effect on our mental health, and then our health behavior. So things like use of toxins, what I call or think of as toxins, tobacco, excessive alcohol use, other drug use, including
Mm.
marijuana. For those people who are, particularly for young people, there's a myth
Right.
out there now that oh, drugs are cool. They use all these mixed drinks where they mix in codeine or whatever,
Wow.
or use marijuana. Those things, there is evidence,
Mm.
abundant evidence that
Mm.
toxins like or other, they can have an impact. And in fact, there are other toxins, lead exposure,
Right.
exposure to pesticides, some of which can be very harmful.
Mm.
Arsenic, things like that. Some of these come into our lives through what we eat. So
Right.
excessive dietary fat and so on. All of these things, salt, all of those
Mm.
things have an effect on us in
Mm.
terms of our overall health. So it's a full court press to be healthy. It's a lot
Right.
of factors. All right. So I mentioned this already.
Right. Okay.
In the U.S., the statistics are 1 in 5 people. I just want you to pause and think about that. So in your life, in my
Mm.
life, in our lives, we probably know a lot of people, and 1 in 4 or 5 of those people experiences a mental health condition. When you think about the serious illnesses, and I should say before I go on, it doesn't always look like you think it should. It's not just
Right.
the village madman or that person walking around naked or talking to themselves. That's actually the picture of extreme mental illness, and that's about 1 in 20 people globally.
Mm.
and you take them as a group. For something like
Okay.
schizophrenia, it's up to about 1%, or bipolar disorder is a little bit 1%.
Mm.
But the more common conditions, depression, anxiety, social anxiety, dementia,
Right.
ADHD, things like that,
Mm.
those are far more common. And people just kind of find ways to cope, or they suffer in silence. And
Right.
I think it's important to say they can impact anybody. Um,
Mm.
we talked about overall wellness as being the goal, and this is according to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, in the US. It defines 8 dimensions of wellness, and you can see them here:
Right.
financial, occupational, emotional, spiritual, which is
Right.
important as well, intellectual, physical, environmental. So overall wellness touches on
Mm.
all of these areas. And I should
Yeah.
say
So
for this, go ahead.
sorry, finish up. I have a point I wanted to just drive at. Just finish up, please.
Yeah, I should say that for persons of faith, which I think represent many people in this learning community, um, there's the scriptures allude to every one of these areas. If you look at, for
Absolutely.
example, we kind of sometimes think about the Old Testament as, how does this really apply to me? Well, if you look at the dietary laws and you look at the environmental health laws that were
Yeah.
issued to the Israelites at the time when they were given, they were revolutionary.
Absolutely.
Those laws, even though they didn't have the science of microbial infections, bacteria, and so on.
Right.
The laws,
Yeah.
as they were issued at the time, would have kept them safe from the way many of these things are transmitted.
Yeah.
So again, in many ways, and when you look at, well, I've certainly been, as we were discussing earlier, in my study of mental health over the years, in residency and beyond that, the things that I keep, the things that keep being discovered, so to speak, you look at the scriptures and you say, this has been documented in the scriptures for
Absolutely.
centuries. Mindfulness was this huge thing about, but it's become this huge thing over the last few years. It's been in the scriptures for decades, for centuries.
Absolutely.
You can see it in
Yeah.
things like,
Yeah.
you can see it in scriptures like Philippians 4, I think it's Philippians 4:13, fix your mind on, things that are true, honorable, and so on. That's
Just. Yeah.
mentally putting your place in
Absolutely.
here now.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's just one example. We can talk about others. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
You have.
so the point I wanted to make is what is exactly what you're talking about in terms of from a faith perspective, the way this wellness and resilience is understood. We already have nuggets of that from the Bible, and like you and I were talking earlier, there's something that Paul says that I wish above all things that you prosper and be in good health, even as your soul prospers.
Mhm.
So it's already tying that the prosperity of your soul, has a way of linking up to actual prosperity financially. There's a link up, to that. You reference the children of Israel, right? I realize that the best way of exercise is actually walking, and God was meticulous about what he wanted them to eat, where he wanted them to dispose of trash, where he needed them to be when it comes to the kind of food they're going to eat, and all of those things. So if you really look at it, it's nothing new to us from a faith perspective. However, from the general research and study, it's been discovered, but we already had that link from the Bible. That was the point I wanted to highlight.
Absolutely, and we'll get to this later. And to your point, we'll get to this later in this discussion. But there's studies over decades that show that there is what I call a faith advantage. Obviously,
Right.
I have to say this in with caveats, but in general, there's some evidence that shows that people or communities of faith tend to actually do better. They tend to do better in terms of their physical health. They tend to do
Mm,
better in terms of their mental health. They tend to
mm,
even do better in terms of their prosperity, wealth,
right.
which, and obviously the balance that is people, there are lots of people around the world that discover these principles and do well, and so it's not obviously
Mm,
exclusively a benefit to people of faith. I think we also have to talk about the idea that the balance, which is some faith practices that can be downright harmful. So so we have to keep the balance. But in general, I wanted to uh, um,
Right.
buttress your
Right.
point.
Right.
So wellness is a journey. It's a set of practices that we build into our lives, and they have to be built intentionally. You were saying earlier in our one-on-one discussion how the idea, the concept of that of living or adopting the athlete's mentality. You talked about corporate athletes and how there's you were reading a paper from Harvard Business
Correct.
Review
Yeah.
about how you people that are very
Yeah.
successful professionally have a regimen, and the regimen based on that
Yeah.
article should include physical wellness or physical health practices, emotional or mental health practices, and
Right.
spiritual health practices,
Absolutely.
which
And
is new.
spiritual. Yes.
Spiritual practices.
Yeah.
Okay. So I kind of this is a term that I sort of put together in writing that book, which we'll talk about how you can get it later. But seven
Mm.
pillars of wellness, and the base one, and actually maybe the very foundational one is sleep. People don't think of it as the foundational one, but it turns out that if our sleep cycle is off or our sleep habits are off,
Mm.
nothing else works. We tend to not
Right.
do well. In fact, I will say the current recommendation for adults is 7 hours a day or 7 hours a night,
Okay.
and consistently, not once or twice a week. Yeah,
Right.
so that's sleep without good rest. There's some problems that accumulate. So lack of sleep continuously is associated with dementia. It's associated with
Okay.
early death from cardiovascular causes, so respiratory or cardiac death, associated
Mm.
obesity, motor vehicle accidents, other kinds of mechanical injury. Common, they're more likely to happen in persons that are sleep deprived chronically.
Right.
Also, from a performance standpoint, it's actually shown that your muscle twitches. That's the basic, functioning of your body is better when you get better rest. In fact, they've done studies on this in athletes. So sleep is foundational. Exercise is critical, and it's critical at every stage of life. No, this is
Right.
not about guilting anybody. We know how, when you're about this stage of life, you're taking care of parents, you're taking care of kids, you have a career, you really
Mm.
have to one really needs to be intentional, but the benefits of exercise are irrefutable at any stage, whether you've always done it or you're starting anew. They're irrefutable.
Mm.
And combination exercise, right? It's not just uh, aerobic exercise, which is things that build cardiovascular endurance, running. Actually,
Mm.
as you age, we tend to lose muscle mass. So, resistance training, weightlifting, calisthenics,
Right.
body mass, and
Right.
body weight exercises tend to actually become more and more important.
So
Important for
let me report myself for full disclosure. I know you and I had this conversation earlier, and we kind of had like a doctor session before we started this. So from a sleep perspective, ideally you said 7 hours. So based on my regiment, I'm doing 6 right now, and you've recommended that I do an adjustment to kind of catch up on that 7, even though my 6 is consistent. Because of the regimental way I do things, there are different times I've scheduled for different things, and by 9:15 p.m. I'm shut down. I'm sleeping already, and 3:15 I wake up because I've built it up over the years. So like you told me earlier, I'm going to adjust that a bit, right? And then from an exercise point of view, just like you mentioned, it's not just the fitness exercise like running and all that. You also told me now that I need to add lifting, weightlifting to what I do. So
Mhm.
thanks for that short session, and then I would get on board and give you a report by next quarter how things have moved on my side. So just full disclosure from me on this.
Well, I think your regimen is incredibly impressive. The fact that you built it over time and are consistent with it. So,
Yeah.
and the advantage of what you've done is with having developed those habits, it's easier to make adjustments than if one didn't have them at all. Yeah,
Right.
so
Yeah.
that's excellent. I personally, over time I've done a variety of things. I've done the P90X program. I've had times in my life where I was so busy I couldn't really exercise regularly. Like during COVID, it was difficult, so I would go for walks.
Mm.
Over the years, I've done various martial arts because they tend to be, or swimming because they tend to be full body
Yeah.
exercises. I've also done
Absolutely. Yeah.
weightlifting most of my life, adult life. Since I've been here, I've done weights or some sort of
Okay.
resistance training. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think the rule of thumb is move, keep moving,
Right.
and
Mm.
don't get injured, of course, and
Okay.
find something you enjoy doing that gets you all those benefits. But if exercise were a pill, it would be the magic
Mm.
bullet for longevity. The
Right.
benefits are cannot be argued with. Okay, so
Wow.
and
Okay.
then what one eats, and it's also a question of not just what you eat, but when you eat. So eating late
Absolutely.
at night is, it's there's some research that shows that it's because your body's generally most people's metabolism, according to our circadian rhythm, uh,
Mm.
metabolism tends to get lower at night as the day wears on and gets really low at night. So you're not really burning calories when you eat late in the day. Also, eating
Right.
things that are very peppery or spicy may keep you up at night. So you want to think about that.
Right.
Interestingly, we've learned about fasting. Fasting is a biblical faith practice, right? Spiritual practice. But interestingly, in the last few years, there's increasing, evidence that it actually helps. In fact, if you look at some studies, places where people that don't eat a whole lot, right, or they tend to focus more on not, a plant-based diet, the life expectancy tends to be higher. They also tend to be healthy and stronger. So we'll leave that leave
Mm.
that there. We talked about avoiding toxins, and we don't usually think of sugar as a toxin, but it's got all the qualities. It's addictive, actually.
Right.
It obviously adds to our waistline, and
Right.
so I think we have to keep that in mind. Alcohol is a socially accepted drug, but it has all the qualities of a drug, and it's associated with a. Actually, let me put it this way: recently in the U.S., there's been, and when I say recently, in the last 15 years, there's been a lot of focus on opioid-related deaths. But tobacco and
Right.
tobacco-related deaths are about 5 times as high as opioid-related deaths, and have been for decades, and
Wow.
this is known, right? Yeah. And alcohol related deaths are in multiples of opioid related deaths, whether it's from accidents or physical injury or physical
Mm.
health conditions that develop as a result of alcohol use, or even things like, they're linked to a high. I think it's about 200,000 or 300,000 people a year that die, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000
Wow.
people a year that die from alcohol related causes. And
Mm.
and that's not counting the social impact of, impact on families when there's a use disorder, or
Right.
impact on things like fetal alcohol syndrome, which is a known cause of mental retardation, or
Mm.
developmental delays, as many things. So this is not say don't drink at all ever,
Right.
but people need to be aware that it's not without consequence, potentially. In
Mm.
fact, there's some research that I've seen over the last few years that shows even small amounts. It used to be thought that drinking in moderation was okay. There's some research now that's showing that even that may not be the case.
Just
So,
avoid it 100%. Right.
so be aware. And I've been interested to see how popular coffee has become in Nigeria. That's not, there's some research that caffeine is actually not a bad thing, but be aware that in excessive amounts, it can
Mm.
cause what's called caffeinism, something that looks a lot like anxiety. And it can
Oh.
also, yeah, for some people, especially people that have a mental health condition, it can worsen anxiety, it can certainly trigger a manic episode, because people that have a
Mm.
bipolar disorder, one of the most important things is to have a regular sleep cycle.
Right.
Have a regular, you know, predictable sleep pattern, and when you disrupt that, then people can have an episode. So that's obviously that's not very many people, but you just need to be aware of that. Then preventative care is really really important, and that looks like what that looks like is knowing your family history and
Mm.
taking steps. So there are people that I personally know that are diabetic and they don't eat any sugar. There are people that I
Right.
know who have a family history of alcoholism. They never touch alcohol.
Right.
So
Okay.
it's knowing your history and making adjustments, but it's also getting your vaccinations. It's getting your recommended preventative checks at the right
Mm.
time. So check
Mm.
colonoscopies, checking for cardiovascular health, all those things. Then we talk
Right.
about the next pillar is mental health, which is maintaining mental health, but it could also mean treating mental health conditions where they exist. And
Mm.
increasingly now, I should say, in many parts of the world now, this is being built into the annual wellness check. So they'll check for domestic violence, they'll check for
Right.
depression, which is one of the commonest conditions. And increasingly now, pediatricians, particularly here in the US, are checking for the onset of mental health conditions because a lot of them start in childhood or the early teens.
Mm.
So there's that, but there's also practices that promote mental health, which we will talk about later. And then I think about relationships as being the final pillar. It's both cultivating rich friendships, which we've had,
Mm.
thankfully.
Mm.
I think about our youth group and
Yeah.
how wonderful that was an experience growing up and all our friends.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
as an adult, especially working adults, you also have to work at that. You have to kind of keep that
Right.
and cultivate that. And one of the keys to having healthy relationships is maintaining boundaries. So that's
Right.
it's your space. This is my space. We have a common space, a shared space. And there are
Mm.
things that are allowed in that common space. There are ground rules, as you talked about in your marriage episode. And then,
Yeah.
knowing how to fight rather than, not rather than trying to avoid fighting completely. Knowing
Absolutely.
what
Absolutely.
yeah, knowing what's permitted, even during those heightened periods of heightened emotion, and knowing what
Mm.
is not. Boundaries are really important. There's an Irish saying, boundaries make good neighbors. So if you
Right.
know what's your space and you know my space, we will not fight, right? Or we can
Absolutely.
avoid some
Absolutely.
things. Yeah, so it's that basic idea. All
Right.
right, thank
So
you.
I have a couple of points I just wanted to touch on while you were talking about this, especially, so I've talked about sleep and exercise, right? And then you mentioned diet, but avoiding toxins. Interestingly, in the last 2, 3 days, I've been watching this Netflix film or documentary about the Purdue farmer on
Mm,
OxyContin,
mhm.
and it was
Yeah,
just mind boggling for me, as in the whole way that whole episode happened, the amount of people that got abused on the drugs as an
yeah,
opioid and things like that. So when
yeah,
you mentioned it, it just went back to, I just finished watching it like last night, and it's interesting that that's something we're talking about. The second thing is about boundaries, and I like the way the Bible says about a blessed man in Psalm 1 verse 1 to 3. There are things that he does and there are things he doesn't do.
yeah.
You understand? So those are the boundaries where they know you, that look, this is my space, this is what I'm doing at this time, this is your space. Yes, we can habitate and all of that, but at the end of the day, let's have that boundary, because it's also a pillar of wellness, and I just wanted to highlight that.
Yes, it is. The whole Purdue thing was sad and tragic,
Absolutely.
unfortunately. Let me
Yeah.
just make one quick comment on that. One of the things I learned in my own personal experience, but I also learned it as a trainee. I did a fellowship in psychosomatic medicine, which is it's the interface between medicine and psychiatry.
Right.
And one of the things you learn is there are many, many medications that can either trigger
Mm.
or perpetuate or contribute to mental health conditions. There's a whole list of them. And
Wow.
oftentimes we don't know. This is one of the things that I want to leave people with. In the book, in the book that we talked about, my book, our book, I should say, there's a chapter there's a whole listing of several medication classes that are
Right.
associated with, and there are things that we don't think about. antihypertensive medications,
Wow.
some antibiotic medications. The very first person that I saw with a psychosis induced by drugs was a person that was being treated by tuberculosis. This was during my house job in UCH. The person was, they
Right.
started him on isoniazid, INH, used all
Wow.
around the world. It made him psychotic for weeks. For
Wow.
weeks. Steroid induced psychosis, very common.
Wow.
Athletes have it, people that use it to enhance their
Yeah.
performance.
Performance
So
enhancers.
making the point again, there are many reasons why people can develop a mental condition, and we can't just, one of the big mistakes we've made in the faith communities, we've attributed it only to spiritual causes, lack of faith, the
Right.
devil. And
Yeah.
what that does, unfortunately, is where a person can be treated by simply removing something or
Mhm.
adjusting something, if we lose that opportunity, then sometimes the person suffers for a long time where they don't have to. All right.
True. True. Yeah.
So moving on now, the faith advantage. We talked about this earlier, but this is based on research.
Right.
People, there seems to be a resilience factor that being a person of faith has. I should say that you can see the same thing. You can kind of see the same thing in people, other people, people who have a strong core value system, right? This is,
Right.
you can see that. I've read stories, for example, of people who had very serious illnesses, cancer diagnosis, and because they were 1,000% committed to their family's welfare, they somehow just hung on,
Mm.
hung on. So you see this. Um, um, we talked about being physically healthier, generally, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes living a healthier lifestyle.
Mm.
And again, this has to be taken in broader context. This is not absolute. This is
Right.
that's individual choice and practice. Having a higher purpose in life generally is tied to better outcomes in terms of overall health. There's some research that shows that people that attended church or religious services regularly did better or
Mm.
do better
Mm.
overall,
Mm.
and is protective to some extent against depression. Let me quickly say that if a person, they're protective, but people can have all of this and still experience mental health conditions, and it's not
Right.
their fault. It's not their
Right.
fault, and people should not be made to feel guilty or criminalized or punished for this. They need help.
Mm.
Now,
Right.
on the other hand, when people are out of balance, they are overcommitted. They have no personal time. They
Mm.
have no personal space. They're involved, or if religious tradition makes people feel guilty as
Mm.
a foundation of their sort of belief system, those things are not helpful,
Right.
obviously.
Right.
So let's
Right.
talk about stress because we all live with it. I should
Yeah.
say some kinds of stress are good,
Mm.
right? There's what you call good stress or eustress. They
Right.
fundamentally, stress is required for growth. If you think about our developmental tasks as individuals, what happens as we get older, the requirements on us as individuals become bigger or become more and more stressful. So we go from childhood where we have very little responsibility
Mm.
to teenage years where we go to college or university and we're required to manage ourselves, which can be a stressful
Right.
adjustment for some people and take on a load of classes. And then we go to adulthood where we have to manage other things,
Mm.
finances,
And
marriage, these big
family and all.
tasks. That is increasing stress on us, right? But we grow
Yeah.
through it. We adapt to that and we grow. At a fundamental level, when we lift weights, we're putting stress on our system, on our bodies, right? Those
Mm.
muscles grow to meet that stress. So that's stress. That's good stress. But there's
Right.
bad stress as well. When a person is in a zone where their stress is exceeding their capacity to cope,
Mm.
um, then or there's very little they can do to escape it or relieve it or resolve it, and they're just stuck in that place, or it's at
Mm.
a point in time when they're particularly vulnerable, like in childhood. That stress can be really, really harmful, and that's where you
Right.
see people having heart attacks. You have people breaking down mentally and having sometimes very serious, psychotic episodes or anxiety conditions, or where
Mm.
you see effect on their marriage, and marriages start to break down. And
Yeah.
I will point us all to COVID. it's so recent that it
Yeah.
was. For most people, it's still a vivid part of a vivid memory. During
Yeah.
COVID, you could see the rates of anxiety when they about doubled globally.
Yes.
The rates of drug
Absolutely.
use went up and alcohol use went up significantly. It
Right.
could, there's all these articles about marriages breaking down because,
Yeah.
everybody was stressed and
We're
there was
stressed.
no
You were
escape.
all together in the same house. You couldn't go
Yes.
anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's an example of bad stress, right? An
Right. Yeah.
illness or a condition that I can't get away from. I will say
Mm.
that it's possible to make tweaks still in our lives that allow us to tolerate or at least cope with some of the stress. But there's good stress and bad stress. I think that's the main takeaway here.
Right. Okay. Great.
Yeah. So here's a listing. Getting married is stressful. Anybody that's been a newlywed, that first 2 3 years, you're working through a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And it can be good, but it can also, if you're in the wrong environment, God
Mm.
forbid you marry the wrong person, or you have other factors like, being, and most of us are not that well, we're not that financially strong when we get married to get kind of building your life together. But if
Right.
you're really in a tough spot financially, or you have, relatives that are making things harder, it can be very difficult. Starting school, changing school,
Mm.
whether it's
Mm.
undergrad or postgrad, or even as a mature student, I had to go back. I went back and got an MBA 5 or 6 years after I finished my residency training. My goodness, it was one of the best experiences of my life, but it's been
Right.
one of the best things I've ever done. But my goodness.
It was stressful. I can imagine.
Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. Oh my goodness.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Having a new child, the promotion, because now you're taking on more responsibility. Shay, you just went through leading through a critical crisis, and I
Yeah.
can still see it on your face, even though you're here, as just your usual personable self. And I can,
Yeah.
but those are extremely stressful times. I could probably write a book about that. Building a
Absolutely.
house, yeah, learning a new skill. These are all good things, right? But they
Mm.
can be difficult. How about bad stress? So if you think about being in a conflict zone,
Right.
uh, living with fear because you can be killed or kidnapped at any time. Being in
Mm.
a Just think about what's happened in our country in the last few years. The
Right.
economic situation for most people, things are 3 4 5 times as expensive as they were. Think
Yeah.
about people stuck in a bad marriage, where there's
Yeah.
abuse, outright abuse. I'm not talking
Right.
about, there's something the spouse has in their personality that I don't like. I'm not talking about that.
Yeah. I
I'm
don't
talking
like.
about
Yeah.
abuse,
Yeah.
or the
Right.
death of a loved one, a
Mm.
spouse, and all the things that come along with it, chronic health problems, all of this toxic work environment. We've got
Right.
to talk about that, or
Mm.
discrimination.
Mm.
Let me talk about that for a moment. um, there's evidence, actually a lot of evidence now, that some of the bad health outcomes you have in minoritized populations and I'll talk about the US, but obviously this is all around the world,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
directly traceable to discrimination or racism. There's
Wow.
research evidence that links it. So let me give you just one statistic. Black women in America have a mortality rate that is 3 times higher than white women. And
Wow.
that is when you adjust for socioeconomic status. So same wealth, same level of
Mm.
education, they're three
Mm.
times more likely to die
Wow.
in childbirth, and it's
Wow.
directly linked to racism.
Wow.
So and we can add other isms, right? Tribalism, you know,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
on. All right, and
Right.
then chronic academic problems. So how do
Mm.
we cope? There are healthy coping mechanisms, there are unhealthy coping mechanisms. Bad coping mechanisms, or things that are not productive, I should say, are things like not sleeping enough, which happens to a lot of us. Procrastination, yeah, it happens to me too.
Right.
I have to
Right.
actually work with it. Procrastination is I'll shut it out of my consciousness and I'll just let it fester
Mm.
without actively
Mm.
doing something. That doesn't help. It actually worsens things in the long term. Blaming
Right.
others, this is epic in our culture, right? It's somebody in the
Absolutely.
village, it's
Yep.
somebody
Yep.
that has never, We
Yeah.
do it. It's done here in the West also, although here it's the government or whoever. In our part of the world, it's my relatives,
Yeah.
or whoever else. Yeah. So, but this is not. It's not productive because what it does is it robs us of agency. It takes
Mm.
the it takes it mentally. It moves us from a place where I have some control, even if it's over the small things in my life.
Yeah.
I have some
Yeah.
control over it. It moves us to a place where we're helpless. Let me give you just a
Mm.
very, very quick story. Mandela, who's one of my heroes, when he was
Right.
stuck in prison and he was put in prison as a political prisoner, he
Mm.
talked about how he decided on the first day that in his mind he was not a helpless person. So the guards would do things like actually urinate on them.
Right.
Very humiliating for somebody who was an attorney and so on, a
Mm.
lawyer.
Mm.
What did he do? He implemented a lifestyle. His prison, you could stretch your hands like this and touch both
Yeah.
sides. He
Right.
would get up in the morning and run across his cell every morning.
Right.
And they contested. It took years, but they went from wearing shorts, which was really humiliating, to wearing long trousers, and they got
Mm.
other concessions over time. But he kept his sense of agency, and you can read about all of this. But what I'm saying is, even in those extreme circumstances, this was an individual who chose. There are small things I can do, and I will do
You
them.
can control.
I can
Correct. Yeah.
control, and I will control those things. Okay, so
Right. Right.
you can read the other list: impulse buying, self injury, which is unfortunately common.
Mm.
Healthier things, if we go back for just a moment, healthier
Right.
things, exercise, we talked about them, reaching out to help, prayer, very
Mm.
definitely, in addition to what we know that prayer works, right? We know that you
Absolutely.
pray and
Yeah.
results come. But in addition to that, just the attitude and the mindset that I can go to God for
Mm.
help makes a difference, right? Eating
Mm.
healthy and so on. All right, next slide.
Yeah, so just before we go, since we came back here, this last point is really critical for me in terms of music and playing an instrument. So at the moment, I don't play an instrument, but I discovered this about myself, 400 level when we're back in UI, that if I'm studying and I put music in my ears, it it syncs better, and I'm able to remember everything when I get back to the exam hall. So in fact, it comes like a vivid picture to me when I'm reading, my books and everything. And from that moment till date, I do stuff with music in my ears, especially jazz. And I call it my genius groove, because anytime I'm in that space, my creativity is there, is high. I can think of stuff. I assimilate a lot of knowledge. So while I'm working in the office, they know I always have music in my ears. Maybe not both AirPods. I leave one there so that I can hear what's happening around me.
Yeah,
But I basically have music playing, especially when I want to do something creative. So I just wanted to highlight on that.
yeah, and there's a scientific term for it. It's called state-dependent learning.
Right. Okay.
There's a term for it, but it's you and my wife should exchange notes because she does the same. She always has
Yeah,
music in her
absolutely.
ear. Yeah,
Yeah.
this is great. Yeah, so when we talk about we talk about resilience, and these are it's basically think about the idea that whether it's sure, you're an engineer, so you know about this.
Yeah.
We have the concept of tensile strength, right? That is, there's
Yes.
a things are designed to bear a certain level of load. If you think
Mm.
about bridges, when they're being designed, the
Yeah.
engineers calculate, and you actually see the warnings, right? Don't
Yes.
pass this bridge if your load is beyond whatever number
Correct.
of tons. Well,
Yeah.
human beings are the same way, actually.
Mm. Right.
There are things that we can do to increase our resilience and things that reduce our resilience. I'll tell you one of
Mm.
the things that can reduce a person's resilience is adverse childhood experiences, abuse,
Right.
neglect,
Mm.
um, having a parent in prison, other things, poverty, that sort of
Mm.
thing. But
Mm.
I personally know people who have experienced those things, and because of their mindset,
They
those
came
things
out.
actually became a fire, like it became
Right.
fuel.
Right.
And so I think the basic idea is we have a tensile strength, we have a certain level of resilience, but it's not static. There are things we can do to improve it. So what are some of the things? One of the key ones I talked about is a growth mindset. I may not know
Yes.
this thing right now. I may not be good at this thing, but even if it never becomes my jam, my thing, I can get better at it. I can learn. I can
Absolutely.
improve. And there's
Absolutely.
science that shows that kids that have that mindset tend to do better than kids that don't, even very
Mm.
bright kids. Reframing
Mm.
is another one. Let me give you a classic example. It's taking something that's happening and looking at it, basically taking my glasses off and putting a new set of glasses on. I'm going
Right.
to look at this thing differently. Give you a biblical example. Paul in Philippians chapter 1 was in prison.
Mm.
He was a prisoner for no fault of his, right?
Right.
This will, I think, resonate with our with believers in the on the in the audience. He wrote, these things that have happened have actually served to advance the gospel, so
Mm.
that other people are now bolder and more willing to talk about their faith. He was a prisoner, and what were some of the pluses that he took away? He was now no there were people in Caesar's household who had become
Yeah.
believers.
Right.
His guards, who were Roman
Yes.
soldiers, some of them actually saw him go through a storm where he
Yeah.
went from the prisoner to the leader. He was the one telling them what to do, right?
Correct.
And they would have told their colleagues, this guy, don't
Yeah.
mess with him. This is somebody different, right?
Right.
That's reframing.
Mm.
This is not a good thing that's happening to me, but I choose to look at it through this alternate
Right.
lens. And anybody can
Correct.
do that. We've seen, yeah, anybody can do that.
Mm.
An upbringing that promotes self-esteem. So this is where we as parents can make or break our children. If we leave them, instead of robbing them of opportunities to struggle, if we give
Mm.
them tools and we allow them to deploy them when they're in our house and under our charge, that's actually what builds self-esteem. It's not affirmation, yeah, the best. It's no, you have the tools, you can deal with tough stuff, right?
Correct. Right.
Sleep,
Yeah.
exercise, diet, these things we talked about. Turns out that when you go
Yeah.
into nature, it's like flicking a switch in our brains when we're in a place where there's lots of greenery, grass,
Mm.
oceans.
Mm.
These are things that reset our brain. There's actual science for this. You take a bunch of kids that are stuck in a class, one group, you take them and you have them walk through like a park or something. The other group, you have
Mm.
them do something else. The kids that walk through the park do better after the break
Right.
than the ones.
Right.
Research,
Mm.
connecting with others, basic, right? This is the core aspect of us as individuals, as humans.
Yeah.
Journaling, practicing thankfulness. Again, these are things that are becoming standard in mental health field, mindfulness, prayer.
Yeah.
Radical
Yeah.
acceptance is again something that we see in the scriptures, right? It's
Yeah.
this thing may be happening, but I choose to see it through an alternate lens. In the moment, you
Right.
can reframe. We can what I call strategic disengagement, which is I can see what's happening, but I choose not to have this fight with my
Mm.
spouse right now. I choose not to
Right.
respond to this situation until I'm in a better state, right? Better
Mm.
place.
Mm.
Then things,
Mm.
active relaxation, deep breathing, muscle relaxation, picking up a hobby, which I think all of us need, and then
Right.
unplugging regularly. It's like, okay, like in your regimen, I see it. This time of
Yeah.
the day, I'm spending with my spouse. This time of the day, I'm not
Absolutely.
working, and there's a
Right.
firm boundary there. All right.
Yeah. I mean, the point here is you need to be disciplined to stick to that regiment, and then you can see the results thereafter. Because I
Yes.
also want the audience to understand that it's not like it's a magical thing or a magic wand. It takes a lot of work, and you have to be consistent, and that's the point. So things like picking up a hobby, muscle relaxation or deep breathing, or in the last slide where you talked about engaging nature, I discovered that doing gardening, just putting your hands and touching mud and soil helps as well. One another thing I wanted to highlight, full disclosure, I know this is now common practice now in our environment, but I have a colleague of mine who is working to become a therapist rather. And we're having sessions where we just sit down and just talk about our emotions, talk about wellness generally. And these are some of the things that she's highlighting that, I can add to myself in terms of having that whole wellness where I do some hobby, gardening or painting or something. We have a common friend, a mutual friend, Brother Ima Silva. who has a gallery and all of that. So those are things I'm also talking to him about, where I can come to his studio and just have a session to just paint whatever,
Yeah,
because I used to draw when I was younger. I used to paint and all, the artistic side of me. So that's another area where I'm trying to develop, just to be sure that I have that complete wellness. So, the audience also needs to know that these are things that you can do, but you have to do them consistently, and they're not just magic wands.
absolutely. What you said.
Right.
So, a lot of what we've talked about is encapsulated in this book. It's called Understanding Mental Health: A Guide for Faith Communities, and it was released in May last year, June of 2023. And
Right.
since then, we've actually revised it, and it's available in Nigeria. It's available on
Okay.
Amazon. It's available through
Right.
BookBaby, but it's available in Nigeria through Roving Heights.
Okay.
And we actually have priced it so that it's within the reach of most people. I think it's 3,000 naira for one copy
Yep.
and 5,000 for two copies. I should point out that the revisions were to add a study guide so that if people want to delve further into the subject, as you were saying, Shay, then they can do so in a small group setting. There's lots of scripture references, but there's also lots of scientific references that you can check
Right.
out, to educate yourself on this. So it's designed for individual. It's maybe 120 pages, something like that. It's 7 chapters. You can probably read this in 4 or 5 hours. It's
Right.
designed so that if you're on a plane, you're flying, you can finish reading it in 3, 4 hours if you want. You can read
Mm.
it on Saturday afternoon if you have time, and you can also use it as a study guide for a small group.
Right.
So I would
Yeah.
encourage people to think about getting this.
Okay, so thanks for this, and just like you mentioned, on a typical Saturday like this is a good thing to to just sit with and read through. Some other things we've mentioned are things that can be done on a Saturday. So, like I was giving an example about painting or gardening and all of that, because I really want people to understand that your weekends are very precious and you should use that period to detox. So usually in my regimen, what I use that for is I watch movies, comedies, I relax with my family. I love sports, so I watch football, the EPL, some other things around, just to kind of relax so that I can use that as a springboard into the new week I'm going into. So you see like a sine wave, that constantly happens. I walk during the week, and then weekends I drop off and relax and recharge and then take it on again. And I've seen that the more I do that, the more productive I am for that week. And before I know it, the 5 days, Monday to Friday, is over. And I'm like, oh, wow, it's another weekend. So these are things that, the community also needs to imbibe for weekends, for Saturdays like this. You can pick up the book, you can do some other things, start a hobby, have friends, even just walking around with 2 or 3 people and just taking a stroll in the evening is a good thing to do to help with your general wellness as well. So thank you so much for that.
Absolutely. I have a pretty regimented um, process for my weekends. There's certain things I
Right,
do, there's certain things I don't do. After a certain time on Saturday, I'm not available for calls. I'm not
right,
going to, yeah. So and there are things that I build into my week. It actually starts very. Listen, the I trained at Maimonides in Brooklyn. It was in the heart of a Jewish Orthodox Jewish community. So I actually
right.
got to see what we call the Old Testament lived out right in front of me. They
Wow.
take the
Okay.
Sabbath very seriously. They won't even press a button like on an elevator. They have an
Wow.
elevator. They called it the Sabbath elevator.
Right.
It was set to stop on, it was 7 floors. It would stop on every floor because pressing a button was work
His
in
work.
there.
Right.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and the concept of the Sabbath didn't go away just because we're in New
Right.
Testament.
Right.
It
Correct.
predated the law, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It
It
was
was
laid
from
down
creation.
from creation, right?
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
so we need that time. All right.
Mm.
So we talked
Correct.
about this already. Oftentimes, people go to their faith leaders to learn, to get help. Without an understanding of mental health, um,
Mm.
they will not get that right help. They may get some kind of help, but they're being able to recognize, okay, this is not just stress, it's not just a bad marriage. This person is actually clinically depressed, or this person is suffering from an anxiety condition. And the good news is these things are treatable. They
Right.
can be
Yeah.
treated, and oftentimes the treatment is straightforward. And oftentimes, people get better. In fact, the quicker you get help, the better. So that's the idea behind putting this in. And we're right now working on a package, a training package for clergy. That if people are interested, we can talk further about that.
Okay. Great.
All right. So, this is a question for the audience. List three general resilience strategies. We talked about this: sleep, active problem solving, connection. So getting together, your house fellowship, small group, friends
Right.
from church, friends from work. All those things are wholesome. There's something they call happy hour. I
Yeah.
initially wasn't so much for it, but man, particularly during COVID, it became a lifeline for all of us.
Mm,
Virtual
mm,
happy hour, real happy hour. Okay.
mm,
Living a balanced lifestyle, journaling is very powerful as well.
mm. Right.
And things you can do when you're stressed in the moment, so you can walk away. Right? Jesus
Yeah.
did this. Fed
Absolutely.
5,000. Let's make you king. He's like, not right now.
No.
Check out.
Yeah.
Just walked away.
Yeah.
He just dropped everything and walked away. Came back
Right.
afterwards. You see
Mm,
Jesus do this again and again, and all of us can do it with
mm.
obviously with respect to the environment and the moment, the
Yeah.
situation. But we can always say, "Please, can I get back to you?"
Right.
Another example just occurred to me of doing that in a charged environment. Daniel chapter
Mm.
2. We're going to kill all of you because the king had the dream which he can't remember.
Right.
We're going
Right.
to kill you.
Yeah.
And he said, can you give us just overnight? That's strategic
Yeah.
disengagement as well. I'm not going to respond in the heat of the
Mm,
moment. Reframing we
mm,
talked about. And then things like this, they sound very soft, but my
mm.
goodness, deep breathing, muscle
Yeah.
relaxation. So the SEALs, Navy SEALs, these are like the elite of the elite of the elite. So
Yes. Yes.
they do deep breathing. In fact, if you go to YouTube and type in SEALs deep breathing, you'll see an exercise there.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can do that at some point. I can just kind of walk us through that. Picking up a hobby rather, unplugging. These are
Mm,
things you can do.
mm.
All right.
Wow.
Thank you.
Okay, so I mean, this is absolutely fantastic. I know, we've done, some level of justice to it, like we said at the start, to demystify everything about mental health. So for the audience, you see that this is not just talking about a crazy man or somebody that has lost his mind and all that. It is about wellness in as a total being, spirit, soul, and body, which is some of the things we mentioned. And you and I were talking earlier before we started about that pyramid of productivity that includes all of this, your physical body, your mental health, and then your spiritual capacity and health is all interconnected to make you a complete, your wellness as a complete person. So this is the essence of this discussion. I know if we had more time, we could sit down and deep dive on a lot of the other things that we just mentioned in brief. But I want to thank you so much for the time. I mean, I just looked up now and we've crossed an hour already. I didn't even feel like we've done an hour, but that's just the way it happens on Achiever Zone. Once we start, we just keep going and things flow. The energy is high because we're talking to experts in their field, and it just goes through like that. So thank you, Dr. Shmoo, again for giving us the privilege of coming on this platform, spending 1 hour with us and sharing from your experience. And thanks for the book. I'll get the details of how to get it and also share it with the community when we post this on the group's platform so that people can go there, and get the book. And of course, we'll be available if we see any questions from anyone in the audience. We'll be available to answer them in the group. So, just to highlight to people that are listening and watching, we have two groups that we created: one on LinkedIn and one on Facebook that is dedicated to Achiever Zone for this season. So, this content will be available only in those two groups for now, so please join the groups. I'll put the details of how to join the groups, um, on this video as well, so that you can click on them and join anyone you prefer, Facebook or LinkedIn, or you can join both. The same content is available across board. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for giving us an hour and 10 minutes of your time to engage on this very, very important topic. Dr. Shmoo, I want to appreciate you. Thank your family for releasing you for this period as well, because I know, like you said, you have things that you've scheduled for Saturdays. But again, sparing that with us is amazing, and I'm grateful. Thank you so much.
Honestly, it was a privilege. I appreciate you having me here, and thank you for, and beyond that, I thank you for being the leader and the man that you are, and sharing this, creating this forum to have these discussions. It's so important, especially now. So thank you for doing that, and I look forward to our next time together.
All right. So I'm going to take you up on an offer we discussed earlier, which is another thing that we can jointly talk about. I'll just highlight it, talking about leading through crisis. You've had your experience with COVID. I've had, some experience with the recent outages that we had across Africa when it comes to internet services, and how we led through it and came out successful at the other end. So we'll try and figure out something that we can do together to just discuss that, maybe with a third person to come in to make it more inclusive, so that you can talk from the medical point of view, I'll talk from the technology point of view, and then maybe the other person from any other area, music, entertainment, legal, whatever it is, so that we can have something enriching. So I'm going to take you up on that in the future. At some point I'll look through your schedule as well, so that we can arrange something.
Absolutely, it would be my pleasure to do that.
All
Honestly,
right, all right,
yeah,
all right.
I think it's never waste a good crisis, like we say.
Yes, that's it. So thank you
Yes.
everyone for listening, for spending time. Very shortly in the month of April, there'll be another episode, which is episode 4, with a different guest of mine, another expert in their field. They will join me, and we'll have a session like this for an hour, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, as the case may be. So until then, stay liquid, keep moving forward, don't give up, and continue to do the best that you can to live a successful life, and enjoy yourself while doing it. Thanks, and have a nice day. Bye.
Thanks.